So, welcome to today's stream. Everybody who is tuning in. As you know, we're doing streams all over the weekend for Hiveworks to basically on various topics. We've got 8 streams total. This is the first one, which is adapting fairy tales and myths to a modern story, with me, Isabel Malalso, who is host and author of Namesake. My partner, Megan Levy-Heaton, who is also author of Namesake. Misha Krivanek, who is the author of Alice and the Nightmare. Alison Shaw, who is the author of many things, including Tigress Queen, Fart in the North, and our best-selling book, Persephone, as well as Atla. I'm going to destroy this one. Harfney? I think I got it.
It's Harfney.
No, I did not get it at all. So Atla, who is one of our editors at Hiveworks, and is very known on Twitter for being extremely wise. So that is everybody. And today we're going to rant about fairy tales and talk about how to adapt them to modern storylines, what to not to do when you adapt them, and why they're so rampant in today's, YA novels and stuff like that. So just a fun little topic that people who usually adapt fairy tales are weirdly extremely passionate about. So if you get them like at a con and corner them with this, you'll get like a whole rant out of them. So this is like the Cliff Notes version of this. The stream should last about an hour, maybe a bit longer if we really get into it. So, hold on to your hats. And anybody who's tuning in to the Twitch channel, if you scroll down a little bit, you'll see different links to our store, which we currently have a 10% off sale with the code SPRING2020. We also have 2 ongoing Kickstarters right now, one for Alice and the Nightmare, which is done by Misha, who's here, for the first book. It's a great comic. Please back the Kickstarter. It's super worth your time. It's really fun. And we have another Kickstarter going on for Amongst Us, which is a romance comic that's also super fun, so definitely check out both. And a shout out to Iron Circus Comics, who are also doing a bunch of streams today for Pajama Con, so definitely check out their Twitter. If you check Hiveworks' Twitter, we have retweeted all the information for that. If you definitely check out their stuff. So that's the preamble. Time to get into it. Let's talk about fairy tales. So, everybody that's here has kinda used a lot of mythology or fairy tales in the works they've done. So I was thinking of sort of starting with the idea of like, why did you pick the tales that you picked for the stories that you're doing, and how did you sort of shape them to the story you wanted to do, and what elements you had to drop or sort of accentuate from the original to sort of do that. So I was thinking we could sort of go by turns, and I was thinking we start with Atla here.
Yay! With me first. Okay. So I am mostly known as an editor, but I also do a lot of writing, and I actually went into editing because writing wasn't paying a lot. And so the comic that I'm currently working on, the graphic novel I'm currently working on, has a lot of Icelandic like fairy tales and folklore embedded in it. And part of the reason why I wanted to work on that was simply because there were a lot of I'm basically working on a little comic about like diaspora and about like feeling like you don't belong in Iceland and stuff like that. And so a lot of the fairy tales that I chose have been kind of reworked into addressing that, or kind of like changed to actively address that. And part of that is honestly just fairy tales are really good at being reinterpreted, and that's one of their biggest strengths. They're supposed to be just kind of like blank templates that you can do whatever the hell you want to do with them. And so it's really, really easy to take, especially something like Icelandic folklore, where you've got a lot of, like hidden people and like elves that live in places that you can't see. And it's really, really easy to take that and talk then about, diaspora, or about conformity, or feeling like you don't at all belong in society or whatnot. And that's kind of why
It's the basic sort of changeling structure, essentially.
yeah, exactly.
So,
Exactly.
are you like more attached to sort of like original tales about a whole people, or are you really focusing more on the specific changeling storyline, which is often like isolating and stuff like that?
Well, in this, I guess I should introduce a little bit because this is a graphic novel that I'm currently working on with an agent and with an artist, but I haven't actively kind of introduced it into the public or anything like that. The story is about a young girl who kind of gets lost in the wilderness and is being hunted by kind of reinterpretations of the hidden people, which are like these you can think of them as a cross between the Germanic traditional like elves and like Irish sort of like fairies, right? And basically, like, oh, it looks like Ali got cut out there for a little bit, but basically, like the way that the story sort of is structured, it focuses more on that, like you said, like the overall isolation angle, because there there isn't a whole ton of like shapeshifters in Icelandic folklore. Because like there's a ton of shapeshifters in like other kind of like worldly culture, but I didn't want to step on a lot of toes because like that's another thing you have to think about when you're thinking about like folklore in general. There's a lot of people want to kind of like boil it down to like cryptids or kind of remove them from the context of the culture that they come from. But that's really impossible. Um, because like these are a greater part of other people or your own like culture. So I didn't want to go into like what a lot of people do. They go into like Native American culture or they go into Southeast Asian culture and they kind of like drag these little bits and bobs of folklore and folklore creatures out. And instead I just wanted to sort of focus on my own and how to reinterpret that for people who are like now coming in or kind of don't feel like they're who feel like they're not kind of part of the society that we're crafting right now.
Hmm. Do you since you got like a pretty good handle on this whole idea, and you were mentioning that Icelandic folks don't really have changeling tales, why do you think that is?
Why do we? That's interesting. Because like Icelandic, Icelandic like folklore is really interesting in a certain sense. Fairy tales and folklore because like basically there's a lot that we can trace when it comes to because like without going too deep into the history angle, a lot of Irish like slavery happened effectively like during the Viking Age, and because the cultures were very similar in terms of like social structure, very similar in terms of like technology, they're basically just neighboring countries. There's no like the Irish slavery didn't bring any sort of like technological advancement or anything like that, but it did bring a whole ton of like storytelling. A lot of these slaves were brought into the family in very ambiguously or explicitly unethical ways. And one of the side effects of that is uh, we saw a lot of melding between Irish fairy tales and the already established more Nordic fairy tales. And we can actually like trace even Icelandic names back to that like the fairy tales and folklore stories being handed down uh, from Ireland to Iceland, right? And I think that kind of creates a unique blend, whereas a lot of other places are so heavily interconnected, you know.
That's really interesting. Thanks for that little opinion piece. All right, so let's move on to the other author that can sort of introduce us to how they work with their fairy tales. So let's move on to Allie, who has mostly worked with myths so far. So, Allie, can you tell us a little bit about that?
Sure. First of all, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear
Okay,
you.
good. Been having mic troubles all day. Um, so when I was in the third grade, my teacher sent us all home with an assignment to find out, oh, what ethnicity are you? And that was the day I found out I was part Greek. And my teacher thought that was so amazing. So she just loaded up a bunch of Greek mythology books on my desk, and they just kind of stayed there for the whole year. And that's how I got involved in Greek mythology specifically. Um,
What
as
aspect
far
of Greek mythology, aside from the anecdotal like introduction to it, interested you? Like, what part of it really seduced you into like, oh, I'm totally going to work out with this for like the rest of my life?
I actually didn't intend for that. um,
No, you were. It's
oh,
mostly
the
accidental.
Yeah, I would say that it was just a myth I happened to be interested in, and um, wanted to offer people a way to experience the myth in a way that wasn't misogynistic, I guess,
Yeah, because
because a
that's
lot of Greek myths
definitely
are.
yeah. Well, since we're one of the topics we're sort of talking about. Oh, right now it's Alison Shaw talking and me, Isabel Melanson. So that's us. Um, so essentially, since we were talking at the beginning a bit about when we're adapting fairy tales, what to drag in and what to drop is an important part of it. So now you're sort of mentioning like, oh, I wanted to work with Greek myths and sort of talk about them in a less like misogynistic way. Did you find that transference to be very difficult or to sort of flow in very easily?
I mean, it's just how you frame things and how you approach them, and when you actually look at a character doing things because they're motivated to do them and not just a passive plot device. In Persephone specifically, um, she doesn't really make any decisions. It's not up to her. Basically, the only decision she ever makes is to lie to her mother about how Hades treated her when she gets back home.
I mean,
So,
as you do.
yeah, can't be reasonable. Um, but think about like what if she had a decision in this that kind of frames the rest of it. Um, and I just think the story's more fun this way.
I also find when you sort of transform a lot of Greek myths, especially Greek myths that involve female characters, when you transform them to give female characters more agency, the stories actually kind of tap a lot into sort of changeling or traveling stories, which is a bit what Atla was talking about earlier, because essentially by making Persephone a story about choice, you transform Persephone into someone who goes to the land of the dead and returns essentially by her own will. So it's a lot of like travel stories. Oh, that's a good question. Do you think it's important to recontextualize ancient myths to a modern audience? And I think we can open that question to everybody, actually. If everybody wants to sort of chime into this one, then we'll continue with the individual talks. So, floor question. Do you think it's important to recontextualize ancient myths to a modern audience? I have a very specific opinion about this, but I'm going to let other people answer first.
It's
So
important to look at. Oh, sorry.
so okay. It's like it's not necessary, but it does give it like a bit of extra depth to it and a bit more reachability. Like if you could do all your research on like the French countryside and the 11th century, but if you take that tale and adapt it to like feeling, I don't know, left out of school, I'm pulling all of these examples just like straight from nowhere, but being able to like connect on a more personal level is, if that's your goal in writing and telling your story, then by all means, fairy tales are a great way to do that because you have very iconic, recognizable characters. And if you twist it to where someone can see themselves emotionally in that protagonist or is interested in their story, then all the more power to you.
There are 3 really good examples of modernizing older tales that I think a lot of people are familiar with. The first one is Easy A, the movie. It is a modern adaptation of The Scarlet Letter. The second is 10 Things I Hate About You, which is a modern adaptation of Emma by Jane Austen. But the third one that I think a lot of people are fans of is Lore Olympus.
No, 10 Things I Hate About You is Taming of the Shrew.
It is? Which one is Emma?
Emma is just Emma. They made a movie, they just called it Emma.
Hang on, I have to Google this now. But especially like Lore Olympus, I think does a really good job of introducing a lot of modern concepts. And it's Clueless, by the way. Emma.
Oh yeah, it is Clueless. You're right.
Sorry, the Lore Olympus does a really good job at introducing modern concepts in a modern setting, but still keeping those relationships intact from the ancient myths. Allie says, you can chime in, Allie. She's the Man, which is an adaptation of Twelfth Night.
Yeah.
There we go. I get... Oh, do you want to go first or should I?
I can go first, yeah. I personally think it's super important to adjust fairy tales and myth to a modern audience just by their nature. Because the idea of a fairy tale and a myth, or any kind of story that's like a fable, is... Oh, we'll get to Disney. Don't worry about that. We're coming for you. Essentially, the idea of modernizing is important because at the baseline, like at the base idea of these stories, because they're fables, their very nature is to be emotional and metaphorical and to essentially talk about illusion and transformation. So if you've got something that's extremely emotional to a point where elements of the story don't really get explained, like Cinderella has glass shoes. How does she walk in them? What are they made of? How are they staying intact? Who cares? It does not matter. Because the idea, the symbol is more important. The idea of someone who is transported from a horrible life to something magical, to a magical evening where stuff improves for her, where she basically pulls her from that in shoes that are impossible, improbable, is a beautiful image. So if you're basically basing what you're making on stories that are just image and emotion, if you try to like stick closely to the story, you're going to get something that's a bit of a jumbled mess and not as interesting. The idea is to really sort of retool these initial ideas into something that speaks to a modern audience by adapting that symbol to modernity. And I think a really good example and a really bad example of that, like I've got sort of two, is my favorite good example of doing it really well is actually this now a bit older novel, so maybe not as modern as like other things we could do, but I was just so impressed by it back in the day. But yes, I can get into that, the Ver and Ver thing, I know it very well. But essentially Ella Enchanted was this kid's novel that was a retelling of Cinderella that was done in a super interesting way and used all the symbolism but woven through the story. And it always really impressed me as like a really good reusing adaptation. Whereas a bad one that I hated was the Alice in Wonderland movie that Tim Burton made, because
oh my god.
I'm not
you summoned me.
I'm not a fan of like looking at fairy tales, looking at all this beautiful emotion, all this beautiful imagery, and being like, what if I did that, but like, edgy. And I'm like, I get the appeal, I really do. Like, I've played like American Mickey's Alice 2, and I was there for that, and it was great. But also, this is stupid. Like,
also, it sucks.
It's sort of this idea that like if you read a fairy tale and you read all this beautiful like storytelling that's woven in, and all you're getting from it is like, ooh, it's a fairy tale, which means that it's all cutesy, so I'm gonna make it edgy, then you're not really connected to the material. And at the same time, there's nothing wrong with wanting to use this material to make something that's very dark and gritty. But I'm just saying, like, if all you're getting through it is that you're doing the quote unquote opposite by making it gritty, then you're not understanding the material at all. Because, yes, we can elaborate on that. We'll do a whole chapter on Disney and why the Alice remake sucks towards the end. Don't worry, we're coming for that. But yeah, it's this sort of idea that like, if you're just opposing the idea of fairy tales, which is like the modern idea of fairy tales that are sanitized and clean and like for children, instead of these tales that were essentially by women for women to sort of teach them about life, then it's like a really weird take, I always find. And yeah, for the anecdote, someone mentioned the ver and ver. So the modern version of Cinderella that we know, because there's a lot of Cinderella tales, like thousands all over the world, the oldest one being from China. But the modern one was actually written by a French guy called Perrault. And in his version, the shoes were made out of verre, which is a word that sounds like the French word verre, which is glass, but is actually different because it's a type of fur. So they were actually like very fancy fur slippers. And when the Grimm brothers actually got a hold of that, they decided that he just spelled the thing wrong, and it was actually the French word for glass because they weren't aware of the cultural aspect of the fur shoe. So that's how the slipper became glass, essentially.
Isn't it always or also supposed to be a euphemism for a vagina because the prince got to try on the first slippers of all the women in the kingdom?
That is one interpretation of it. A lot of interpretations in the 70s, including one by Bruno Berghem, I think. I can't remember his exact name, was that everything was vaginas in fairy tales. But, you know, Perrault was really just trying to write like stories for children, so I don't think he was trying to do that. It's just ver at the time was really popular. So he just used it because because it was very popular at the time for the contemporaries of the fairy tale. So people would get really into it if she was wearing that kind of shoe. So the whole vagina symbolism is only works as an interpretation if you're seeing it from like the 70s. And recontextualizing fairy tales as super dark or like edgy or vagina symbols was extremely popular in the 70s. So, you know, hooray, that happened a lot. But yeah, continuing, Misha, if you've got an opinion about... No, you already did yours, modernizing. So who's next for the modernizing question? And then we can get into Disney.
That's me. So, I wanted to actually I was actually going to say a lot of what you Isa said, but I would even go further and say like the exact point of these stories is to be transformed or to be redone for a contemporary lens or even a timeless lens, just like something new. I think the entire point is to use them for whatever necessary purpose you have at the time or whatever's interesting you. And like to engage with them as just this story about this hero going over here or this story about this princess going over here or this witch doing that, and just like refusing to engage with it outside of the surface level or the base moral is to misunderstand what effectively these stories are and what kind of storytelling they really are, what kind of community storytelling they are. And I think that's also, you know, we were talking about how this is made by women for women very often. I think that's part of like when we
with the caveat that most of it have been written down by men, but they were like writing down stories that women told them essentially.
Exactly. And like I think if we look at the type of storytelling, of community storytelling, we'll see a lot of similarities between other types of storytelling that are often dominated by women. by like fan fiction and other like things like that, where the name of the game is transformation or to develop the idea further. And I think that's not only like a good thing, but I think that it's necessary, and I think it's the entire point of these stories. And to try and just be like, I'm just going to tell, like Hercules again. Like, it just seems like
once more with feeling and less gay.
Well, but like and I think that's
someone
like,
needs to commit to the gay. Someone needs to.
That's exactly the thing. Is like even the most famous current example of Hercules in the form of the Disney movie, which we'll get to. But if we just touch on that gently, even that movie is a radically different approach from the traditional Hercules stories, and incorporates a lot of then modern discussion of like 90s corporatism and like selling out to the man and shit like that. So like it's like even Disney like has a tendency, whether good or bad, to use these stories in the exact purpose they were meant to be.
I feel like we're kind of circling the Disney drain, so we might as well just commit and just slam on them. We're kind of... Is it time to slam on Disney now? Is it time?
That's all you, sweetie.
Please, God.
Before we get to that, I would like to just make a little comment. Rather than looking at it as these fairy tales have a purpose to be reformatted and everything, I've always seen it more as the stories endure because they remain relevant. Like, no one would care about them if they weren't still relevant in the first place.
Yeah, it's because they're so emotional. The imagery is so evocative. It's always relevant. Like, Beauty and the Beast will never die.
There are certainly stories that will die off over time, but rather than their purpose to be continuously remade, I just think it's more of we would only bother to remake them if we still thought we had something to say about them.
Yeah, and I mean, I think that's also because a lot of the problems they talk about are still extremely relevant, which is depressing. Like Cinderella, emotional abuse still exists. Beauty and the Beast, romantic relationships and the complications that go with them still exist. A lot of stuff is still real. And a lot of problems that are expressed in these fairy tales, the emotion that's addressed in them is still real too. So, always going to be relevant in some way. Even if some fairy tales fall out of favor, others are going to be resurrected as people rediscover them and just sort of used again and again. Like Persephone as a fairy tale wasn't that popular that long ago, but like since the internet, Persephone and retellings of it have been going crazy. Like we've got one that's beautiful that's been made by Ali. Webtoons has one that's beautiful, and Lore Olympus. I've seen a bunch like on Tumblr, on Twitter. Just everybody's all about Persephone right now. Because,
there were a few on Tapastic about it.
Yeah, it's just a really hot myth right now. And, with reason, it's awesome. Oh, yes. East of the sun, west of the moon. Please, people make this. Atla, I know. I know it's coming. All right.
I literally turned my mic on. You said my name and I turned the mic off.
Yeah, I knew it. It's coming. I myself am working on a Cinderella adaptation called Ember and the Spark Gobbler, which is a graphic novel. So I'm really, I'm doing a lot of Cinderella research, so I'm really in the Cinderella zone. So one day I'm probably going to have to do a companion stream that's just Cinderella, just my opinions for 2 hours. But now it's time to slam on Disney.
Please, God. And so, going back to the Tim Burton Alice one, because I've been sitting on this egg for years now. So If you want
since you do Alice as a comic as well, I think maybe it would be interesting if you talked about this egg like in proportion to your comic. Like,
oh yeah,
how you disagree with their decisions and went a completely different direction.
true. So let me start out by saying that if you want a really, really comprehensive video essay on why this movie doesn't work and why the story and the adaptation sucks, check out Jack Saint's video essay on the Alice movie. I think it's called like Mistakes Were Made or something like that. Where is it? Yes.
Yeah,
Tim Burton's Tim Burton's Alice in Wonderland was a mistake. It wasn't until that essay that I was able to properly articulate why I hated this movie so much. And a lot of it is also that I just very much dislike the Mad Hatter adaptation and the weird way that he's portrayed. And there's one scene in the sequel movie also that he's like sick and dying, and then all of a sudden Alice comes in and she's like, your family's okay, and I believe you now, even though that was never a question in the first movie. What? And he does this weird CGI transformation where like his hair gets all orange again and his eyes bulge out. And at that moment I was just like, no. And it was bad.
The thing I don't understand about the Hatter as a whole in that adaptation is like removing the fact that they don't understand his character at all and they kind of stripped him from like the chaos, which was the interesting part about it. Who the frick thought that we wanted to see Johnny Depp dance?
Jesus Christ.
Tim Burton thought we wanted to see that when really it was just him.
Yeah, Tim Burton, keep your fetish out of our movies, please.
Oh, and let's not forget the deleted scene from the script where Alice and Hatter actually kiss after this dance. And there's also a line in there.
It's like a freaking, you know, those birds of paradise that dance to seduce partners.
Yeah, exactly. And then there's a line in that script where it's like the Dormouse looks on disappointed, and it's like, did the Dormouse have a thing for Johnny Depp's Mad Hatter? I'm sorry, what?
Wait, wasn't the Dormouse the cute one with the sword, or what?
Yeah, that pulled out that beast's eye really graphically.
Maybe she was disappointed that she didn't get to kiss Alice. Maybe the Dormouse was gay.
Oh, galaxy brain take. Issa, your brain is so huge.
The Dormouse gay.
But yeah, so another reason I really dislike that movie, and it's my own reason. It's like not the movie's bad. Let's just say that. But my own reason is that it has become the norm for Alice stuff, and that can also tie into how Disney is monopolizing entertainment as a whole. But now when people think Alice in Wonderland, they don't just think of the book, they think of like this bad movie. And it's always like these weird, like the weird names and Helena Bonham Carter. And as someone who has done a lot of research into Alice stuff and like done extensive research, it is like a huge pet peeve of mine, just being like, no, there was a book first and it's not all bad and you can adapt it to be what you want it to be within reason. And that's my own burden to bear in the end. But
essentially just turned it into a hot topic.
Oh, God, yeah, basically.
With a dance.
Yeah. But
sorry, please continue.
Oh,
I mean,
sorry,
I can see in the chat, real quick, maybe we could talk about that. People are saying that Alice used to be so political, But I think a lot of the politics that were in the original book are still relevant because it's basically about, you know, rich people not listening to anybody else.
Oh, definitely. Like, it's a lot about a young girl trying to find her way through a world she doesn't recognize, which can be interpreted as like the adult world. And the Tea Party specifically, there are all these weird rules and these weird, like, this weird etiquette that she has no idea what to do with, and she sees it as strange and weird. And meanwhile, the people of the Tea Party, the Hatter and the Hare, they're always like talking over her and ignoring what she has to say. And eventually she just gets so fed up that she's just like, screw it, and just leaves. Like, that is easily, you know, a young girl going to a fancy dinner party and, you know, her weird aunt is like, no, you use the salad fork on the end. And it's like, why? They're all forks. Why can't I use them?
Use to stab. Make the dormouse gay. Hashtag.
Oh, let's get that going.
Gay.
All right. Does anybody else have anything else to say about Disney and their modernization vis-a-vis what you prefer in your modernization? Someone else.
Yeah. Hey there.
Hey.
So I was gonna say what frustrates me in particular about the Tim Burton's Alice in Wonderland is that it's not really a bad adaptation of Alice in Wonderland the book, because it's not an adaptation of Alice in Wonderland the book. It's a bad adaptation of American McGee's Alice, the video game series, which did the whole...
Well, Disney tried to get the rights to American McGee's Alice and to the comic Fables. And when they failed to do both, they made Tim Burton's Alice, and then they made Once Upon a Time, which is hilarious to me.
Both because, like, I remember watching Once Upon a Time, and it was... like the first season, and I'm like watching along with it while I was getting into Fables for the first time, and I'm like, but this is just a bad ripoff. And in the back of my head, I was like, well, people have different ideas, and like Disney has made so many stories that it just has to be a coincidence. And to hear you explicitly say that, I'm like, I knew it. It happened.
The weirdest thing about it, too, is that back in Fables, because in Fables, they have a specific bad guy. Spoilers for Once Upon a Time, by the way, for if anybody cares. But in Fables, they have a bad guy, and they couldn't use the same bad guy because, copyright infringement. Obviously, they would be stealing from the comic. So in Once Upon a Time, they actually go with Peter Pan as a villain at some point. You know, among all the other villains who are apparently all related to each other, but we'll get back to that. But they used Peter Pan as a villain at some point, and Peter Pan as the villain was actually what they wanted to do in Fables originally, but they couldn't do it because Peter Pan had certain, like, rights tied to it, so you had to be careful on how you adapted it, which is something that we had to deal with in Namesake also. However, Disney owns some of those rights, so they could do whatever the fuck they wanted. And they did.
I was just gonna say, like, the thing about it about the American McGee's Alice is that it's very 90s, and even the sequel from the late 2000s is still very 90s, but it definitely works a whole lot better than Tim Burton's version. Number one, because of the video game interactiveness, which allows you to actually just like explore it much more visually. And secondly, because it like weirdly, it still sits with the themes a lot more, you know? Like Tim Burton's Alice in Wonderland, I haven't seen it completely. I like saw snippets when I was watching it once.
Well, it's you're definitely correct, because the movie and the video that Misha mentioned references a lot. Because Tim Burton's movie, the theme was basically like feminism, but then he like tripped and fell and missed the goal. Whereas American McGee's Alice, the theme is insanity. So like the imagery and the edginess added to it just works really, really well. Even the thing that they usually do where they put like these girls from fairy tales, they put them in like madhouses to be edgy. But in the case of American McGee, it works because the theme is insanity. It's mental it's mental health and, you know, issues that are tied to that. So when you say that American McGee sticks the landing way better than Tim Burton, you are right, because in Tim Burton we can absolutely tell that they missed the theme. But then, you know, in American McGee's, they've just freaking nail it. Even the boss at the end is just like the reflection of your madness, that you have to stab a lot or you're gonna die.
Yep, that's completely true. And I think, like with what you were saying with themes, I think there's a lot of people who want to just like adapt these stories and have it be like edgy, without really understanding that, like, especially now in 2020, it's been like 30 years since that trend started, like 30, maybe even, you know, like we were saying 70s. So like 50 years since that started. So like, I remember, I think like, it was a story, Sucker Punch. I think it was not directly tied to like fairy tales, but it had like this kind of genre pastiche, and it kind of dipped its toes in the Allison McGee.
Yeah, well, the Sucker Punch was also about mental health.
Exactly, but the thing is, like, I remember watching it in theaters and being like, "Wow, this is so tired." Like, I was, I think, like in my early teens, and I was watching.
It's
very
I was like, pretty, but he gets the message completely wrong.
It is very pretty.
He just...
I remember being like with my friend, and we were both like teens, and he's like, you know, like a young 12-year-old boy, and I look at him and I go, for the first time in my life, I want to walk out of a movie theater. And he's like, no, we have to sit and watch this because we have a friend at home who loves American McGee's Alice, and we have to sit and we have to finish this movie so we can look her in the face and say it sucks, so she doesn't come and see this movie.
Like, I thought it was fine, honestly, until I found out it was supposed to be about female empowerment, essentially from the angle of, oh, be sexy, use that to your advantage, women, which is basically do what men want you to do anyway, but do it for you.
Lift that butt in the air, but for you. Put on makeup forever and then go out in a mini skirt with a machete, but for you, girl. Do it.
And then die when you're no longer useful to me.
Do it, girl.
And it doesn't even go into like actual, because like a couple of, this is getting a little bit off track, but like a couple of the like superhero stories actually kind of try at least to grapple with that. Like, look at that and go like, okay, but why? What does that say about this character? Is she insecure? Are people pressuring her into it? Like, there's a couple of stories that at least attempted to grapple with the theme itself, you know?
But I think you bring up a good point, because especially in the movie industry, they keep trying to rewrite and modernize these superhero myths, which are relatively not that far in the past, and they're failing so hard, especially if you're DC Comics. Except for Wonder Woman.
That's true.
I'm sorry to sort of cut it off, but we're closing on the last 10 minutes, so I thought it would be good to bring the discussion back to a specific question and let everybody sort of give an opinion on it. Sorry to cut the slamming short. So I thought it could be interesting for the last little lap for everybody to sort of talk about, like, since we were going over, you know, the things we don't like about adaptations, especially Disney, maybe talk about the stuff we like about adaptations and that we ourselves like to use. Just a little positive note for the end. Though we should definitely do a longer stream where we just straight up like dunk on Disney, because I feel there's a lot of material here.
Agreed.
So, you know, what do you actually like from adaptations in the last 10 minutes? So Atla, you start.
Well, that you've kind of made a mistake here. I'm gonna run out the clock just by rambling, but I thank you for allowing me. But So what I would say, what I like is that there are more people that are coming into just storytelling and having the opportunity to tell their own stories and tell the stories about their own culture. We're seeing more people who are paying attention to like being a little bit more sensitive on how they use like folklore and folklore stories from cultures they don't belong to. And that's a slow shift, but it is a clear shift, and I really appreciate that. And the adaptations that we're getting, just from like women of color or from Black women, like even when they just adapt the most basic like European fantasies, they tend to be really interesting and they tend to bring really interesting things to the table. And I think that we're becoming much better at figuring out how to adapt these stories to modern day in general, regardless of who you are as a person, without it being quite as dated. Because we saw that a lot in the 70s, where they would adapt stories to like the feminism of the time or the political sphere of the time, and then you look back at it in like 50 years in the future, or like in modern day, and you're like, this looks really, really, this feels dated, and I feel like it would have felt a little bit dated like 10 years after it originally got released. So I think that now we're getting a little bit better at adapting these stories in slightly more timeless ways, which I really appreciate because it's in the spirit of the fairy tales that we're adapting.
All right, next up, Allie, what do you like from adaptations right now? What is your thing?
Kind of similar to what Atla mentioned, just the fact that different perspectives as of late, and that like a lot of the fairy tales originally were written down by men, even though they were told by women. But now we're seeing women really control the narrative a little better so that it gets presented in a way that is more fun for us. Are getting twisted to be more about a girl who's constantly a victim. You have her saving herself rather than relying on some male hero to come and do it. So I like that the trend is changing more towards that, towards like advocating for yourself.
All right, Misha, how about you? What do you like? What's your deal?
Well, in like all these trends that Atla and Ali have mentioned, they're fantastic. But for me personally, what I really love about adapting fairy tales is just like a moment of, it's in the research stage where you're like trying to find the core of like, what is this about? What can I recontextualize? What can I adapt? My huge example for this is when I was writing my Valor Cup story, the Cravat legend, and I found through research that like originally it was a Sorbian legend that was meant to uplift a people that were oppressed by their masters, and a way of basically taking the sorcerer's apprentice tale and saying like, hey, you can overcome your master, you can overcome these horrible things that are happening to you, and taking that and realizing that like, oh, this would be a great way to adapt a LGBTQ centered fairy tale about like love and affirmation and validation. And it turned out really positively, and like really, I personally really like how it turned out. So it's that sort of nugget of this works and it's good. I love that, and that really sustains me.
That's awesome. Megan, how about you? What do you like of adaptations?
So, what I love, in addition to what everybody else has already said, is that it opens the original material back up to reinterpretation and criticism. And usually when you do see stuff presented in a new format, like with webcomics or in movies, and somebody then goes in and says, hey, I'm going to analyze this, they didn't go all the way back to that original source material, and you learn not only something new about that source material, but you also learn about the adaptation as well. And I'm just really geeky and love stuff like that.
That's really good. For my side, obviously, like everybody else, I'm going to chime in and go like yes to what everybody else said. But I feel like, me personally, what I think is really good on fairy tales lately and adaptations of them is that I feel like there's a rediscovery of the sense of enchantment. Because for like a really long time, adaptations actually went really dark and edgy. And I think the best example of that, which is actually the motivator behind making Namesake for me, the initial idea before Megan came in and told me that we should totally do this because it's awesome. Essentially, I read the novel Wicked, which, as many people know, there is a very good musical that is based on it. And the book just doesn't really have that sense of wonder that's tied to the original Oz books, which at the time I had not read. I read them after discovering Wicked. In English, it was really hard. Because I'm French, for people who don't know. So I read Wicked, and I was kind of disappointed by the complete lack of enchantment and sort of the focus on the dark, gritty edginess. And then I watched a recording of a musical that was very, very legal and totally not filmed on a phone. And just having this sort of like fun aspect to it was nice. And, you know, when I think about the really good Disney movies, not the bad ones that we don't like, but the really good ones like Tangled, are usually around a character that has this idea of enjoyment and enchantment. And I feel like that's something people forget. Even for the fairy tales that are very dark, there's usually this idea of like the strange, the glamorous, glamour back to the original meaning of the word, which is like fairy transformations. And all that stuff that was there in the originals, that's kind of used to be integrated to real life and still is in certain parts. Like Ireland still won't pave over fairy circles. And that's just like this enchantment and this like joie de vivre that's incorporated to the tales is just something that is coming back right now. Partially because of the female voices retelling the stuff. And I think that that's like a really fun thing to bring back, especially after the 90s fatigue of the edgy. I don't know if people have like responses to that.
But I actually was gonna add, because you were saying the with Ireland, because I was talking about how Iceland is Icelandic folklore is a mix of Irish and Nordic folklore, and we have similar laws where we don't actually if a rock is considered like a fairy rock where they are supposed to live in, or a fey rock, it legally can be like sanctioned off as and like not touched. So there's a couple of roads around the country where they made the road wrong and they actually had to like loop around the rock.
Don't touch the rock.
Do you want to bring up, I've noticed a lot of people are like getting upset with the trend of gritty, dark fairy tales, but fairy tales were always dark. They were always a little bit scary, and you do need to retain some of that.
But it's not...
One of the things Disney does right is that they do incorporate the magic into it.
Yeah, they definitely... Well, when they're not making...
They balance it very well.
Yeah, when they're not making a bad movie, it's very well balanced. But the bad movie is definitely...
And Tim Burton's not in charge of it.
Yeah. But
exactly.
The fear, the fear and the mystery, that's definitely a part of it. It's just, I feel like there's a difference between like fear and mystery and grittiness. It's kind of like the core line.
Yeah. Like, stop trying to make it real. It's not real. It's a fairy tale. That's the point.
Yeah.
But there's also something lovely in that saying, like, the world it can be dark and it can be scary, but there's also magic and wonder and reasons to keep on going and people to fight for and to fight for yourself.
Plus, I like this idea of magic as like a force. Like, you can be afraid of it. Like, it's a force you don't necessarily understand or control. Like, the grittiness can just be like, magic's crazy, y'all. It doesn't have to be like the evil queen is a despot now. Well, I mean, it can be that if you wanted to, but, you know, layers are interesting.
What I find interesting is that for a lot of people, Disney is your first exposure to fairy tales, unless you're lucky enough to have a parent read a book to you at night, like my parents did. So I feel like, especially when you have these more modern adaptations like Tangled, which does it does have the whole relationship with the Madame Gothel and Rapunzel, but also focuses on her whole sense of wonder, whereas the original tale was a cautionary tale against getting pregnant.
Well, only in some versions, not all of them.
Yes.
I think...
Thanks, Grimm.
Grimm, you bastards. I love the Grimm
You want a
brothers,
really
but
fun
also...
Grimm tale, look at the robber bridegroom.
Oh my god, Grimm. I love them because they're big contributors to fairy tales coming to us from like the Dark Ages, but also, what the hell? Like some of these. So we're about done. I feel like what we discovered today is that we could do a whole series of these with a different topic every time. So, you know,
Podcast.
Yeah, if you guys would like Hiveworks to do several episodes just on fairy tales with this crew, and go for a different topic every time, I think that would be really fun. So this is like these streams that we're doing now to sort of replace Emerald City since it was canceled are sort of our first venture into this, but we'd really like to continue this. So if you would be into a podcast hosted by Hiveworks on this topic and many others, please let us know. Tweet at us with your opinions. We would like to hear from you. I think it would be really fun because I'm ready to talk about this for hours, and clearly we've only scratched the surface of this topic. It was a fool's errand to try to fit in an hour, really. So again, for the people that have just joined in, this is being recorded and will be posted to the Hiveworks YouTube thing. I'm definitely seeing a lot of people in the chat saying we should do a podcast, so we'll probably try to get that sorted and have that done for you guys. I would like to thank everybody who is here today. Again, to sort of reiterate for the people that came in late, the people that are in the podcast right now, we've got me, Isabel Maloso, and my partner, Megan Levy-Eaton, who do the webcomic Namesake. Please give it a read. We also have Misha, who is the author of Alice in the Nightmare, which is currently on Kickstarter for book 1. Please check out the
I'd also like to say that the Kickstarter just passed 13K, and we're about 2K away from the goal, which is really, really exciting, and I'm super, super excited about that. So let's keep it going.
Yeah, Woo! We did it. So Alice in the Nightmare, check it out. Back the Kickstarter, it's awesome. We've got Atla, which is one of Hiveworks' editor and a very charming editor who is super talented and has a great Twitter that you should absolutely follow. Atla, if you want to, or everybody here, if you want to push your Twitters in the chat, go for it.
Oh, that would mean I would have to find the Twitch link. Hang on. I do love that I've accidentally somehow managed to make my entire livelihood off of me having a decent Twitter account.
I mean, gotta start somewhere. Next person that was here, Ali, who is the author of Tigress, Queen, Far to the North, and Persephone. Please check out Persephone in our store. You can totally buy it. Right now we've got a sale, so definitely take advantage of that if you want that sweet, sweet graphic novel. And read Tigress, Queen online. It's awesome. Very tense. Good story. So thanks everybody for coming. I hope you guys will all be down for podcasting later, because apparently that's a great idea.
Yeah, absolutely.
Sounds like fun.
Yeah. Thank you everyone for tuning in, and this has been really, really fun. I'm looking forward to more streams and more trashing on Disney.
Don't we all? All right. Have a great day, everybody. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you.